I'm going to use Descartes' argument from illusion, the first skeptical argument presented in Descartes' Meditations, to show a method of approaching arguments in philosophy. Here is the argument. What I have up till now accepted as most true, I have acquired either from the senses or through the senses, but from time to time I have found that the senses deceive, and it is prudent never to trust completely those who have deceived us even once. Descartes' ambition in the Meditations is to establish some lasting results in science, but his scientific approach is much different from ours today, and very much resembles the method of geometry. He feels that one must begin with propositions that must be true, and from these deduce other propositions that also must be true. According to Descartes, his method ensures certainty, which is ultimately what he wants. He wants his lasting results to be certainties. To find such certainties, Descartes remarkably claims that he must first rid himself of all his former beliefs, lest they are false, and search for something about which he can be certain. So he considers a series of skeptical arguments and promises if they can show that any one of his beliefs is questionable, he will reject it. The argument from illusion is one such skeptical argument. If it is successful, then we must reject all knowledge from sensory experience. So let's get to it. Our first step is regimentation. This is ordering the argument in a clear and sequential way. To start, let's look for the most concrete claim. It is prudent never to trust completely those who have deceived us even once. Let's make this more general. If anything has sometimes even once deceived me, then it is prudent never to trust it completely. We have changed what Descartes wrote and now face the danger of distorting his argument. But if we look at our new formulation, we see that we have preserved his intended meaning. I formulated this claim in an if-then form to give Descartes' original statement a more precise logical form. Now let's fill in the rest of the argument. Premise 1. If anything has sometimes even once deceived me, then it is prudent never to trust it completely. Premise 2. My senses have sometimes deceived me. Conclusion. Thus it is prudent never to trust my senses completely. We have successfully regimented the argument, and we move on to step 2. Now we consider the logical form of the argument and ask, is there a good logical connection between the premises and the conclusion? If so, then we say the argument is valid. Validity stipulates that if the premises are true, then it is impossible for the conclusion to be false. Consider an example. If there is a dog, then there is an animal. There is a dog, thus there is an animal. If you have a dog, then it is impossible for you not to have an animal. This logical form is called Modus Ponens and is always valid. Consider another example in the Modus Ponens form. If one is a UCLA student, then he or she has an ID number. Chewbacca is a UCLA student, thus Chewbacca has an ID number. This is valid. Since all UCLA students have ID numbers, and Chewbacca is one such student, he must necessarily have an ID number. You might object because Chewbacca is not actually a UCLA student, or even real. But this doesn't matter, because for now, you are only concerned with form, not content. What about this example? My car has stuttered to a stop, my gas gauge reads empty, thus my car has run out of gas. This is not valid, or as we say, invalid. Although it is reasonable to assume that I am out of gas, it is possible that I have not run out of gas. Maybe my battery died. If so, the conclusion my car has run out of gas would be false, whereas the premises are true. This violates the definition of validity, so the argument is invalid. What about Descartes' argument? Let's look at it again. If anything has sometimes even once deceived me, then it is prudent never to trust it completely. My senses have sometimes deceived me. Therefore, it is prudent never to trust my senses completely. The form of the argument should now be familiar. The argument has the logical form of Modus Ponens and is valid. If you should never completely trust something that deceives you, and your senses deceive you, then you should never completely trust your senses. There is no other possible conclusion. Descartes' argument passes the test. Even if the argument from illusion was invalid, it would still be unwarranted to reject the conclusion once and for all. The senses may still be unreliable, but this argument fails to prove it. Step 3 involves soundness. If Descartes' argument is sound, then it must meet two conditions. Number 1, the argument is valid. Number 2, the argument has true premises. Soundness is interesting. Suppose that you had two beliefs that you felt were true, but when you put them together, they logically implied an undesirable conclusion. The problem you now face is that you must accept this undesirable conclusion or change your beliefs. There is a related interest in skepticism. Sometimes we have beliefs that may logically imply skeptical conclusions. For example, if we take the idea that every claim should be justified, we run into a problem concerning knowledge. For whenever someone claims such and such, we can always ask, well, what's your justification for such and such? And so on. At what point could we say, we know? The argument from illusion is similar. If the first two premises of the skeptical argument are true, then you can't be certain that you are watching this presentation, for that relies on information gathered by your eyes and ears. To determine if the argument is sound, you must first be sure that you are interpreting the premises correctly. For how can you say that something is true or false if the meaning is ambiguous? Suppose I say gimbals are green. Well, what are gimbals? If you don't know, then you can't know that they're green. Let's interpret each potentially problematic word in the premises to get a clear idea of what each premise is saying before we can say whether they are true or false. In the second premise, Descartes speaks about the senses deceiving. What does this mean? How can the senses deceive? Well, usually, when someone deceives me, I am led to a false belief. Maybe we can extend this to the senses. Suppose a building far off in the distance appears to be round, but it is actually rectangular. In this case, I had a look around and said, this is how things are, and I was wrong. I was led to a false belief. So now we understand the meaning of the premise. We ask, is it true? Is it true that the senses sometimes deceive? I think so. Here's an illusion that demonstrates this. These line segments are of equal length, but our senses are telling us these segments have properties that they don't actually have, namely that they are of different lengths. So Descartes' second premise is true. What about the first premise? The problematic words here are prudent, trust, and completely. What is meant by prudent? Let's take prudent to be synonymous with wise or reasonable. What about trust? Isn't this like rely on? Suppose I was taking a blindness test and identified two black dots. The examiner tells me I was wrong. One is a black dot and the other is a blue dot. Here, I could not rely on my senses to determine the correct answer. Completely is more complex. We must consider if we're talking about completely in the sense of scope or degree. Consider scope first. When I say I do not trust my senses, I mean I do not trust my senses when distinguishing between two similar dark colors. However, when asked to identify a shape, I am usually right. I trust my eyes where shape is concerned, but not when distinguishing similar dark colors. So my scope of trust is not complete. Now consider degree. How do I measure degree of trust? Consider the following two statements. Number one, you said that you would take me to the airport, but I called a cab company just in case. And number two, I knew you would pick me up, so I didn't even bother calling a cab company. Clearly, the second statement expresses a more complete trust, or a higher degree of trust. Let's first look at the premise from the perspective of scope. It appears that if something has deceived you in one set, it asserts that if something has deceived you in one set of circumstances, then you must reject that your senses are reliable in all sets of circumstances. Obviously, this is false. Just because I can't distinguish among hues doesn't imply that I cannot distinguish among shapes. What about degree? If something is sometimes unreliable, should I reject it as completely unreliable? Clearly, this is an extreme overreaction. If a person is 1 second late, are they now completely unreliable? Do they consequently have zero reliability? Clearly not. Given these considerations, the first premise is obviously false. If you are not convinced, suppose you were looking at a faraway building and thought that it was round, but later discovered that you were wrong. How did you discover that you were previously wrong? Well, you had to rely on your senses. You walked up to the building and said, the building is rectangular. This shows that conceding Descartes' second premise actually undermines his conclusion. In order to concede the second premise, one must presuppose the reliability of the senses for acquiring knowledge. And so we see that Descartes' skeptical argument from illusion is unsound, because premise 1 is false. Let's review this method briefly. Step 1 is regimenting the argument, or putting it in premise-conclusion form. Step 2 is determining the validity of the argument, or checking its logical structure. Step 3 is determining the soundness of the argument, or checking to see if the premises are true. Truly dismantling an argument requires a deep understanding of it, and this can only come from a rigorous study of each component of the argument, and thus the pedantic nature of the petulant philosopher.